Chapter 2. Tuck, as soon as we get the boat loaded, we have 2 more calls to handle. Department of Natural Resources Law Enforcement Officer Captain Robert Bob Pike called to his partner, Sergeant Michael Tucker, a bright young man that had been hired just 2 years ago but showed an incredible aptitude for the job. Tuck was 27 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall with a medium but muscular build. He wore his hair close cropped in a military manner, and even in the 95-degree heat of these mid-September days, his uniforms always had that just pressed look that had been ingrained by a 6-year hitch in the Marine Corps. The one thing that Bob Pike liked the most about this young man was his even temper when confronted with unpleasant situations. Bob had been an officer with the DNR for almost 20 years, and had seen quite a few of those situations that could have been avoided if the men that had been confronted for various crimes, poaching game being the worst offense, had been given enough room to cool down. The worst was when a young, hot-headed officer almost shot a man over a fishing license dispute when he thought that the fellow was digging for a gun that turned out to be his wallet. The negative PR following that incident had given the department a black eye that took several seasons to heal. One of those calls is about those anti-hunter lame brains interfering with some hunters that were scouting for places to put their stands up in advance of opening day on the WMA over on the other end of Woodbury. And one of the state troopers need to talk to us about a wreck or something last night. Tuck drove the 19-foot center console boat under the trailer and then blipped the throttle on the 150-horsepower outboard to push the heavy boat completely forward so that the safety chain could be attached before Bob pulled it up the ramp. Once all of the gear was secured, Tuck came around and climbed under the passenger side of the four-wheel drive Ford F-150. "What's going on with calling us to look at a wreck site, Bob?" Tuck asked. "Did they find some poached animals in the wreckage?" "That's something that I can't answer," Bob replied. "We'll check out the wreck, then swing over to cite those anti-hunter clowns for interfering with a legal hunt. Not that it'll keep them from doing it again." The drive from the landing on the Waccamaw River was a relatively short one through Conway, South Carolina, then about 10 miles out of town to the crash site. Bob and Tuck engaged in a bit of speculation as to what might be going on, but neither was prepared for what they found on their arrival at the scene, where the South Carolina troopers and several county deputies had blocked off the right-hand lane leading up to the bridge approach. Just behind the officers' cars was a truck of the WLIB news crew. Pulling the truck and trailer, and behind the deputy's car they saw Deputy Isaac Bumgarner with a state trooper waving to them from the bottom of the embankment. "Hey, Ike, trooper," Captain Pike called as they made their way down the steep incline. "What in the world is going on that we need 2 of South Carolina's finest for?" "We found Val Simmons' truck down here in the woods about noon today, after his wife called to tell us that he didn't make it home last night. I must have driven by 4 or 5 times before I saw it went through that heavy brush," he replied. "We also found Val, and that's where you come in. We didn't want to move him until you boys got a look at him. He's torn up pretty bad." "Val is down there?" both wardens asked at once. Tuck knew Val from writing a citation a year before for operating his boat under the influence, but Bob Pike had known him for years. Val was basically a good young man with a wild streak, and Bob had watched him grow up in the same little Baptist church that he attended just a few miles from where they were standing. Both men were somber and silent as they followed Ike past the wreckage of the truck to where the body lay. A state trooper, 2 other deputies, and the coroner's personnel moved back when they approached so they could see the condition that Val was in. Bob Pike's eyes filled with tears as he gazed at the torn and partially eaten remains, and Tuck knelt to examine the corpse more closely. His 6 years in the Marine Corps, 4 of them served in the bloodiest campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, had hardened him to the sight of carnage. Val lay on his back, eyes staring straight up in the blank stare of the dead, his head covered in dried blood from the massive trauma to his scalp and face. His clothes were ripped mostly off the body by what Tuck speculated was a crash impact and secondary impacts, and his legs were buckled up under his body in a way that suggested multiple breaks to both the upper and lower leg bones. In the summer heat, the blowflies had already laid thousands of eggs inside the torn flesh, but what was most disturbing was a large open wound just below the rib cage and the intestines that had been pulled out and down over the lower body. Because of the blood spray on the shrubbery, it was very obvious that something had fed on Val shortly after the crash, and while he was still alive. His heart, lungs, and parts of his kidney appeared to have been eaten along with most of the chest muscles and upper right arm, Ike said quietly to both wardens. We thought that you fellows might have an idea what in the world would do this. Tuck moved slowly around the body and looked through the leaf and low vegetation that gave the area a heavy cover. There were no tracks that might indicate what animal had done this, although both men suspected coyotes, which were reaching an epidemic population in South Carolina. I don't see anything that would indicate coyotes or hogs doing this, although that would have been my first guess, said Tuck. I'd have to agree with that, but maybe the coroner can shed some light after the autopsy, Bob replied. Ike, go ahead and send them back with the body, and we'll come out later to sweep the area further for sign. Oh, Ike, make certain that the camera crew does not hear anything about an animal attack. He was noticeably upset as they walked back to the truck and asked Tuck to drive over to the Woodbury WMA kiosk on Highway 378 so they could handle the anti-hunter matter. What do you think, Tuck? The older man asked in a quiet voice. I've never seen that kind of damage in the 20 years that I've been working for DNR. Bob, I just don't know. It certainly wasn't coyotes or hogs, so I'm leaning toward a bear. There were a couple of sightings in the swamp this past year. Darn shame about Val, though. What a character. I wonder if they've told his wife yet. Excuse me, officers, excuse me, came a shout from the red-haired woman reporter as the cameras followed her to where the men had walked to their truck. Will you tell us why 2 Department of Natural Resources officers were called to this wreck site? She asked in a matter-of-fact, people's right-to-know manner. Nothing to tell, ma'am, Bob replied. We were in the neighborhood, and I knew the fellow that crashed. There's nothing to report. Tuck suppressed a grin at the frustration that appeared on the woman's face. She was obviously put out to be standing in the sauna of the PD swamp with a temperature nearing 100 degrees and not getting anything newsworthy. They arrived at the Woodbury WMA kiosk and parking area late in the afternoon to find a group of very noisy demonstrators shouting anti-hunting slogans at 3 hunters that were getting ready to leave in disgust. Thank God you guys are finally here, one of the hunters shouted to the officers as they got out of their truck. These jerks have been following us through the woods making all kinds of racket since about noon. Can you do anything to help out? I'll handle the protesters, Tuck, if you'll get those hunters calmed down, Bob Pike said. Also call for some backup just in case these fellas try to run before we can get them all sighted. Tuck talked to the hunters and took their statements, assuring them that this problem would not be swept under the rug, as one of them stated. Just as he was finishing up, Tuck noticed one of the protesters easing away from his buddies while his partner was distracted and trying to sneak into the brush at the edge of the parking lot. Tuck sprinted over to the man and took him by the arm. Let me see some identification before you leave, he said in a not-so-friendly tone to the protester. He noticed that the man had no muscle tone in his arm that he now held, and there was a general air of laziness about him. One thing was certain. The fellow was scared to death of what might come next. Please, sir, he gasped in a quivering voice. I didn't mean anything bad by being here. I don't want to lose my job. That's not up to me, sir, but it is my job to enforce the law, and that includes protecting hunters from harassment during a legal hunt. Now show some ID, or we will have to arrest you on the spot." The protester shakily handed over the identification, and Tuck thought he was on the verge of crying, which seemed peculiar considering the fairly light penalties that might be imposed on these people. "Sir, you seem to be more concerned about this than I would have suspected. Do you have anything else to tell me?" And then after seeing the driver's license, Jonathan. The name on the license was Jonathan Oakes, and Tuck thought that it sounded familiar, although he had met a lot of people in the 2+ years that he'd been a DNR law enforcement officer. "I just don't want to lose my job," Jonathan replied, "and if it gets found out I was involved in this protest, I probably will." "What kind of job do you have?" seemed like the right question, but Tuck was shocked to find out that the effeminate young man in front of him was a high-ranking biologist with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. "The law is the law, Mr. Oakes. I have to write this citation because you willfully violated the part about interfering with a legal hunt." It was all that Tuck could do to keep the disgust out of his voice as he issued the citation. "You can go now. Just appear at the magistrate's office on the date listed on the citation, and have a nice day." Jonathan Oakes was close to tears for most of the drive back to Columbia, South Carolina, after his run-in with Sergeant Mike Tucker. A graduate of Syracuse University in New York, Oakes had come to the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources right out of school, and had slowly risen to the top of his pay grade as a wildlife biologist. Fortunately, Sergeant Tucker had not recognized him since they had traveled in much different circles within the department, but it was only a matter of a very short time before his clandestine anti-hunter activities would come to the awareness of his superiors, with disastrous consequences for his career. "If only I had not been so stupid," he cried while slamming his hand into the steering wheel of the hybrid that he drove outside of work. Jonathan Oakes had harbored a dark secret for the last 5 years, a secret that would soon be discovered because of a stupid decision to take part in this protest. Tormented, he drove slowly up Highway 378 to his apartment in Columbia, South Carolina, and Ralph Warren, his life partner. Maybe by talking to Ralph they could come up with a plan to protect his job. It was almost dark before all the statements were taken and the citations were written, and Tuck could see that his partner was pretty shaken up by Val's death. "Bob, there is no need for both of us to drive back down to the accident site. Drop me off at my truck, and I will make a stop tonight on the way back to the marina, and we can meet there in the morning on my way back in." Tuck was bothered by the lack of sign around the body and wanted another look at the scene, even if it had to be by flashlight. "Any other time I would have to say no, but today has kind of taken the fire out of me," Bob answered. "Besides, Abby will want to get the women in the church together as soon as possible to reach out to Charlene Simmons." Tuck's vehicle was parked at the landing where they had met that morning, and the drive back down was a quiet one. "I'll see you in the morning," Bob called out as he drove out of the river access area. Before Tuck climbed into his truck and headed for the crash site, he pulled the Remington 870 shotgun from its case behind the seat and checked to make sure that the chamber was clear and that he had 5 3-inch Magnum No. 4 buckshot cartridges loaded in the magazine. Something gnawed at the back of his mind about Val's body, and he knew that the shotgun in his hand during the half hour or so that he would poke around in the brush down there would relieve a good bit of that anxiety. The DNR-issued Ford pulled up to the end of the guardrail, which Val's truck had struck before sliding down the embankment, and Tuck could not help but think how close the boy was to just kissing the rail and not ending up on the bottom. He had seen many such situations in Iraq where one move either to the left or to the right would have meant a different ending into a deadly encounter, and had formed the conclusion that when it was your time to go, you really did not have too much to say in the process. You just better be ready for it. "Well," he kind of chuckled to himself, "I know that I'm ready. I just hope I don't have to be tonight." He racked around in the chamber of the Remington and made certain the safety was on. With the shotgun in his right hand and a heavy aluminum 3-cell flashlight in his left, Tuck eased down the embankment to the place where Val Simmons had been attacked. That feeling of dread that had saved his butt several times in Iraq was back in a big way. So he shifted his right hand to the pistol grip of the riot gun, making it faster to bring into play. Then he reached down with his left forefinger to turn on the tactical light that was mounted under the barrel in front of the magazine tube. All that was left in the spot where the truck came to rest was a torn-up patch of dirt and underbrush. Tuck looked at the ground carefully for any sign that an animal had pulled Val from the wreckage, but found nothing. Shining the flashlight in the direction that the body had been found, illuminated only the tree trunks and low-lying shrubbery as Tuck moved slowly through the vegetation, while checking carefully the ground for clues. Suddenly he was stopped by what seemed to be an almost inaudible, hair-raising, low-throated growl, coming from about 20 yards ahead of him, just past where Val had been found. He brought the shotgun to bear quickly, but could only see the brush directly in front of him. Squatting to try and get a look under the brush canopy, Tuck supported the shotgun with the back of his left arm so he could use the flashlight and keep the gun trained on the spot that he thought the sound had come from. As he panned the barrel of the shotgun from left to right slowly, a small twig broke with a light popping sound to his right side. He quickly swung to cover the area, in time to catch a glimpse of something large and light brown bounding into the swamp. "Darn deer," he exclaimed under his breath, "almost gave me a heart attack." After his pulse slowed to normal, Tuck eased over to where Val had been attacked to give the ground a good examination for any sign of the attacker, but did not find anything to identify the culprit. He panned the light one more time into the swamp, and then decided to look at the area where the deer jumped when he came back in the morning with Bob Pike. Tuck couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched, and all of his senses were on high alert as he backed out of the shrub and made his way to the truck, covering his exit as he went with the muzzle of his shotgun.